At 6, the Prime Minister fights on as her future hangs in the balance, and the Chancellor warns the Cabinet spending cuts are coming. The Cabinet gathered at Downing Street as the Chancellor warned of the cuts, and Liz Truss tried to bolster support for her leadership and regain authority.
If the two of them work together and are a success, and I'm going to do everything I can to try and make sure that that is the case, then I think she will lead us into the next election.
We're now having an open discussion about whether they're going to have a further change of Prime Minister. 3 Prime Ministers in 3 years. And, you can't go on like this, shutting the public out.
Also on the programme tonight, the families raising concerns over maternity care at a hospital trust that is already under investigation. After competing without a hijab, breaking Iran's strict rules, this climber now says it fell off accidentally. And it started as the British Broadcasting Company with just 4 employees. Today, the BBC is 100 years old.
And on BBC London, a special report on record levels of microplastics in the Thames and a glimpse inside Bond Street Station on the Elizabeth line ahead of its opening.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. The Prime Minister has been battling to regain authority and shore up support as doubts over her future continue to swirl at Westminster. Liz Truss chaired a meeting of Cabinet Ministers this morning. The new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, told colleagues that they must find savings from their departmental budgets. Last night, the Prime Minister apologised for the mistakes made since she entered number 10, but she insisted she was going nowhere and said she would lead the Conservatives into the next general election. Our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been talking to Conservative Party members in the safe seat of the Cotswolds.
Is she finished now?
As ministers met this morning, the questions continued.
Is it time for a new leader?
Uncertainty about the political and economic choices that are centred here in Westminster, but will echo around the country. This part of the Cotswolds is typical Conservative turf. Liz Truss came here to make her pitch to party members over the summer. So now she's had to ditch much of what she offered and apologise. Where does that leave the party members who just months ago made her Prime Minister?
I voted for Liz Truss, but I regret it. The values that I hold don't seem to be the values that some modern Conservatives are holding. And I just don't understand some of the decisions that have been made. They are not Conservative decisions.
I've been a member for years, and this is the first time I'm totally questioning it. And it's because we're not uniting. I think we're more backstabbing and we're destroying our own party from the inside. We have a Prime Minister, we should be supporting her.
In Westminster, efforts are underway to shore up support. The Cabinet told today spending cuts are coming in the quest for economic credibility, with almost everything on the table, even potentially pensions. That could mean more unpopular decisions. And in here, there's already deep unrest, though Conservative MPs don't agree on the path or the person they should now follow. For some, the economic choices the Prime Minister makes with her new Chancellor could be key.
If the two of them work together and are a success, and I'm going to do everything I can to try and make sure that that is the case, then I think she will lead us into the next election. If it's not a success and if it doesn't work, then the Conservative Parliamentary Party will have to think again.
Labour say any further shift should be the choice of the country, not the Conservative Party.
Many people now feel that the real risk now is carrying on with this lot rather than actually having a general election, bringing in a Labour government and securing our economy. That's the first thing that absolutely needs to be done.
Back in the Cotswolds, there's no clear consensus about what should be done next or on the Prime Minister.
She persuaded me. I thought she was very strong. She seemed to come across very well. So I voted for Liz in the end, but she really has become quite a weak personality. Yeah, I'm afraid that I feel that she should go.
I didn't vote for Liz, but I voted for Rishi. But I have a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who I respect, the democratic decision, and I want to give it time to see whether the changes in the policies will actually bear fruit.
The needs of the country come before the needs of our party. We are a patriotic party, and we need somebody in place immediately. So I don't think that there is simply the time to have a leadership contest.
These conversations are taking place at every level of the Conservative Party, right across the country, and that is where the consequences will be felt too. Alex Forsyth, BBC News in the Cotswolds.
Well, let's go to Downing Street. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is there. It seems to have been a somewhat calmer day than yesterday. The Prime Minister trying to shore up support. How have you judged the mood?
Yeah, I think that's a fair reflection, really. I think outwardly, at least today, Sophie, there's been a sense of the anger and the anguish and the turmoil within the Conservative Party coming a little off the boil. Now, don't overread that remark. It's still in the mid-90 degrees. It's still simmering and steaming, but it's not boiling over in that out-of-control way that it felt it was to a degree yesterday and at certain points during the Conservative Party conference. Why? Well, there hasn't been a public flashpoint today. There hasn't been a moment where the Prime Minister has been out in public, potentially, bluntly, irritating some on her own side. Instead, she's been meeting them privately, attempting to reassure. The view as far as the interview that I did with the Prime Minister on the news last night is concerned amongst Conservative MPs, some not impressed by what she had to say, others though reflecting that she'd be in a more grave position if she hadn't been willing to talk. So what about the conversation about who might come next were Liz Truss to be toppled? Well, that's where at the moment those who want to see the back of her run up against a difficult spot because they can't necessarily agree who they would want or how they bring that about. And there's also a fear that were she to be toppled, there would be a clamour for a general election. And if you're a Conservative MP right now, looking at the opinion polls, that is the last thing you want, the last thing you need. Talking of flashpoints, I mentioned them a moment ago. There could be another one as soon as tomorrow. Prime Minister's questions for Liz Truss. It could be deeply awkward.
Chris Mason, our political editor. Thank you. Workers are facing 2 decades of lost living standards with no real wage growth. That's according to the head of the TUC, the umbrella movement for the UK's major unions. It comes as energy bills are set to rise from April and the new Chancellor says government spending cuts are coming. Francis O'Grady has called for a general election and warned of further strike action to come. Our employment correspondent Zoe Conway reports from the TUC conference in Brighton.
Brighton might be basking in the autumn sunshine, but there is real fear here about the onset of winter. Tasha and her grandmother Marilyn are dreading their energy bills.
It keeps me awake at night. I've been stressed, I've been ill about it, being able to afford my rent, food shopping every single week, even be able to afford school clothes and to actually send my children to school.
I can't see any hope at all. I just think things are going to get worse and not better. I just don't see things getting better the way they are at the moment. I really don't.
TUC, get off your knees! Close by at the TUC conference, there is anger that pay has not kept up with inflation.
And if ministers and employers keep hammering pay packets at the same rate, UK workers are on course to suffer 2 decades, 20 years of lost living standards. Over the next 3 years alone, real earnings are set to fall by another £4,000.
This month, hundreds of thousands of public sector workers are being balloted on whether they want to strike. Wilma, who's been a nurse for 35 years, is voting for industrial action.
We won't be worried about people coming out on strike. What will happen is we're worried about how we keep them in because they are so angry.
She says her colleagues are struggling to survive on their pay.
I met a healthcare support worker who works in the community with elderly patients between community and hospital, and she told me that she's already decided she's not putting her heating on this year because she can't afford to eat and heat.
Ministers say difficult decisions lie ahead and they're not ruling out cuts to the health budget, but finding any savings will be challenging. The NHS Confederation represents trusts in England. It says, thanks to inflation and pay rises, this year's funding shortfall is £7 billion. The body representing councils in England and Wales says the sector has a funding gap of £3.4 billion next year.
Public services are really struggling in the aftermath of the pandemic. They do not currently have enough money, even without cuts, to deal with that aftermath and growing demand. And therefore, any other cuts that the government chooses to make is going to have a further detrimental impact on the performance of critical services.
The government says it's determined to make work pay, which is why it says the national living wage has had its biggest increase for 6 years. Zoe Conway, BBC News, Brighton.
Well, there's a special day of coverage across the BBC tomorrow looking at how the rise in living costs is affecting you. We will be in Sunderland all day speaking to small businesses and families and getting advice from our experts. That's cost of living, tackling it together across BBC radio, television and online tomorrow. Maternity care in one hospital trust remains fraught with problems despite an independent inquiry into what went wrong with the care of mothers and babies over a decade. A report into the problems at the East Kent Hospitals NHS Trust, which will be published tomorrow, is expected to be damning. But an investigation by the BBC has revealed that families and staff say safety concerns still remain, as Michael Buchanan reports.
Yes. Yes.
Jamie Goddard is a healthy, thriving month-old baby. His parents, Stacey and Steve, are naturally delighted as well as extremely thankful because Jamie nearly died. Last month, Stacey went to the Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother Hospital in Margate. What greeted her was a crowded, short-staffed unit. After a long labour, Stacey knew the baby was imminent.
I said to her, you know, I know my body, it's my fourth baby.
But the midwife caring for her went on a break. Jamie was therefore delivered by an inexperienced, poorly supervised student midwife.
He had the cord wrapped around his neck. She didn't even see that. She straight away, naturally, just sort of picked him up and went to put him straight onto my chest, which obviously really constricted his windpipe.
Jamie was whisked away by another midwife, and for half an hour, Stacey, who lost her previous child at 22 weeks, didn't know if he was alive or dead.
I am very, very lucky he's alive, and I know what it's like to walk out of that hospital without a baby, and I thought that was going to happen again.
The family say the student midwife should never have been in that position, but the evidence we've seen suggests it's not a rare occurrence. A UK-wide survey of trainee doctors in maternity care paints a damning picture of the trust, particularly another hospital it runs, the William Harvey. In comparison to the UK average, trainees at the hospital say they were far more likely to be forced to deal with problems beyond their abilities, worn out at the end of their shift, and supervised by people they thought were incompetent. This maternity expert says a lack of staff is hampering care, but that hospitals across the country could do more with the people they have.
Failure to escalate concerns, failure to manage things when things go wrong, those are things that could actually be improved with the right training, and we're not seeing that on the front line.
Tomorrow's report will look at maternity problems of the Trust between 2009 and 2020. More than 200 families have spoken to the inquiry team, but despite the focus that brought, mistakes kept happening.
Put your arms up a little bit. You got to hold him.
6 months after the review was set up, Abel Barker was born, but his twin brother Otis never made it.
Is that your baby brother?
His mother Sarah had called the QEQM hospital in Margate just 3 days before she was due to have a caesarean section.
I phoned to say that he'd had unusual movements, increased movements, and then a sudden stop in movement. There was just lots and lots and then nothing.
But a midwife told her it wasn't necessary for her to come in for a checkup, and by the time she went in, Otis had died. The hospital later admitted breaching its own guidelines, saying she should have been examined.
There's an identical little boy who's growing up alongside us and his siblings, and he is here and his brother isn't, and that's not fair. That isn't fair. I'm sorry.
In a statement, the Trust said they apologised unreservedly to every family that failed and were working hard to make improvements. The pace of these changes, however, is far too slow for those who feel the Trust let them down in recent times. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Kent.
Ukraine's President Zelensky says 30% of the country's power stations have been destroyed by Russian attacks. He said that there was no longer any space for negotiations with the Kremlin. Russia has stepped up attacks on electricity infrastructure with drones and cruise missiles in cities away from the front lines, causing blackouts across the country. After 2 days of major disruption on one of the country's busiest roads, 2 men from the Just Stop Oil climate group have been arrested after climbing down from the top of the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge. The crossing on the M25 over the River Thames in Dartford has been shut as the protesters took action they said was against the government issuing new licences to explore for oil and gas. John Donnison reports.
More than 400 feet above the Thames, you can just about make out their orange banner. Hanging in hammocks, the 2 climate activists who shut down one of Britain's busiest bridges. The group they're from is called Just Stop Oil. They want the government to stop issuing new licences for oil and gas exploration, and they say their increasingly extreme action is necessary.
Unfortunately, those less disruptive ways are nowhere near as effective. We have tried doing marches, we tried holding placards on the side of the road. It doesn't work. This is an emergency. Expect us anywhere, expect things to escalate. I empathise with everybody who has been disrupted. I really do. And the government can end this anytime they want by issuing a meaningful statement to say that there should be no new fossil fuel licences in the UK.
And it certainly has caused disruption. Drivers backed up after the police shut the bridge because of safety concerns.
When it comes down to ordinary folk not being able to get to work, hospital appointments, loads of other things, I just think it's disgraceful. I really do.
Well, I think probably the underlying message is probably something people need to listen to, but I think the ways they go about it is obviously something that needs to be addressed as well, because they can't bring the country to a halt in different places. That's not appropriate.
And the local MP isn't happy either.
We've already got severe traffic problems in Dartford. We've also got very bad air quality in Dartford, and their actions simply add to it, and that's why I say it's very counterproductive of them.
The bridge is just the latest direct action protest by the Just Stop Oil group. Last week, here at the National Gallery in central London, they threw soup at Van Gogh's famous Sunflowers painting. Incidentally, it wasn't damaged, it was behind glass. And this morning, protesters glued themselves to the tarmac on a major highway in West London. Morning. The recently appointed Home Secretary says the government's new public order bill, which is currently going through Parliament, would crack down on such protests. Just Stop Oil says more than 450 of its members have been arrested during more than 2 weeks of action, but they're warning to expect an escalation, despite beginning to climb down tonight. John Donnison, BBC News.
The time is coming up to 6:20, our top story this evening. The Prime Minister has been battling to regain authority and shore up support as doubts over her future persist at Westminster. And coming up, China is asked to explain why a protester was beaten up at the country's consulate in Manchester.
And at 6:30, we meet the teenager winning prizes for getting more girls into computer coding. And after leading us through lockdown, now Joe Wicks is helping young people realise their career potential.
It was just over 2 years ago that a number of high-profile British gymnasts began coming forward with stories of mental, physical, even sexual abuse while training for their sport. Their stories sparked a major review into what had been going on in the world of gymnastics, and some gymnasts began legal action. Today, as it tries to reassure gymnasts and their parents about the future, British Gymnastics has announced it will now name on their website any coaches who have been banned as part of a zero-tolerance approach on abuse. And it said athlete welfare would be prioritised over winning medals. Our sports correspondent Laura Scott reports.
4 months on from a damning review that found systemic abuse within British gymnastics, today comes a promise of widespread reform from the woman in charge, with success measured more on memories than medals and membership figures.
This is about acting on that abuse, making sure that there is no physical, mental or emotional abuse. If it's not fun and enjoyable and you're not having a positive experience, then raise questions. Everybody within gymnastics has to take that responsibility to really see the reforms that we are committed to, and I am committed to.
British Gymnastics has today published a 40-point action plan for delivery by 2025, which includes mandatory coach development to prevent a recycling of poor practices, the formation of gymnast coach and club advisory groups to address accusations British Gymnastics was an insular organisation, and an improved complaints management system. The governing body is also closing a loophole to mean more roles, including choreographers, physios and masseurs, will come under its jurisdiction. And from now on, any coach who is banned will be listed on its website.
They will not have BG membership and they will not be able to coach within British Gymnastics. This is also part of a wider sports sector reform where we need to have a coaches register.
That would stop coaches who are banned in gymnastics from going on to coach in tennis, for example.
That's exactly it. This has to be a sports sector-wide commitment.
38 gymnasts have brought legal action against British Gymnastics for the abuse they say they suffered in the sport, but only one has seen their case settled so far. Those involved say the process is taking a serious toll.
For many of the gymnasts, the delays is causing unnecessary ongoing anxiety and mental health issues. And we would really call on British Gymnastics to make sure they speed up the processing of these claims.
British Gymnastics is adamant this is not just a box-ticking exercise and there is a genuine desire to implement a zero-tolerance approach to abuse, but it knows there will be no quick fix to a scandal of this scale. Laura Scott, BBC News, Lilleshall.
The government has called on China to explain the behaviour of its staff at the Chinese consulate in Manchester during a protest on Sunday, saying it was extremely concerned at the apparent scenes of violence. One MP has claimed that one of China's most senior diplomats in the UK got involved. A Hong Kong pro-democracy protester was beaten up in the grounds of the consulate. Our diplomatic correspondent Caroline Hawley is outside the Chinese embassy in London for us, and there are about 30 or 40 protesters at the time of peaceful protest. What did staff do?
That's right. So this all happened outside another Chinese official building, and it coincided with the opening in Beijing of the Communist Party Congress, which happens every 5 years. It was a smallish protest, and footage from the scene shows men in masks, in face masks, apparently from the embassy, tearing down posters and placards. And then you see a man in his 30s dragged in through the gates of the consulate. He's then punched and kicked, and Greater Manchester Police say they then went into the grounds of the consulate essentially to rescue him because they feared for his safety. He apparently spent a night in hospital. Now, Alicia Cairns, the MP you referred to, a Tory MP, said that the Consul General was involved in ripping up posters, and she described what happened at the consulate as a chilling escalation. And as you said, the Foreign Office has summoned the Chargé d'Affaires. They wanted to express serious concern about the footage, and they have said that the right to peaceful protest must be respected in the UK.
Caroline, thank you. Well, while we've been on air, the RMT union has announced further rail strikes next month in the ongoing fight over jobs, pay and working conditions. Rail workers will walk out on November the 3rd, 5th and 7th. The union represents more than 20,000 workers at Network Rail, which maintains and operates the infrastructure, including signalling. Its General Secretary Mick Lynch accused Network Rail of dishonesty in negotiations. An Iranian athlete who competed in a climbing event in South Korea without her hijab says it dropped off by mistake. Some saw the move as a gesture of solidarity with the recent protests against the compulsory hijab laws in Iran. A post on Elnaz Rekabi's Instagram account says it was unintentional and that she is on her way back to Iran with the rest of the team. BBC Persia's Rana Rahimpour reports.
This Iranian climber has become a symbol for the protest movement for not wearing the mandatory headscarf. Elnaz Rekabi was representing her country in South Korea when she made what appears to be a very public show of support for women back home who are fighting against the compulsory hijab. To the alarm of her family and friends, Elnaz Rekabi then vanished from her hotel. There are reports her phone was confiscated. This post then appeared on her Instagram. I, Elnaz Rakebi, it says, apologise for getting everybody worried. Due to bad timing and the unanticipated call for me to climb the wall, my head covering inadvertently came off. BBC Persian understands she was sent home early, with one theory that the authorities wanted to avoid protesters gathering at Tehran airport to welcome her. In 2020, Iranian chess umpire Shohreh Bayat also refused to cover her hair at an international competition.
I was asked exactly to write an apology letter on my Instagram and to apologize publicly, and I was given a list of things to do.
She later sought asylum in the UK. The biggest anti-government protests in more than 40 years started after the death of a young Kurdish woman in morality police custody for allegedly not wearing her headscarf properly. Human rights groups say at least 200 people have been killed and thousands detained. Women continue to protest, whatever the risks. Rana Rahimpour, BBC News.
The BBC is 100 years old today. The corporation started in 1922 as the British Broadcasting Company, with just 4 employees and a promise that there would be no news broadcasts before 7 p.m. A lot has changed since then. Our media editor Amal Rajan reports.
2LO, Marconi House, London, calling.
A century ago, this country did a curious thing. It set up a company that would use wireless communication to engage the public. And so the BBC was born.
Put the statement in to get everything off.
10 seconds.
Over that century, it has faced few bigger tests than the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
Do we have to go?
Yeah.
We can go, Chris.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Yep.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
BBC is interrupting normal programmes.
Opt-in.
For 100 years now, the BBC has been a mirror to the nation, from the announcement of war.
This country is at war with Germany.
Later on in the day,
reflecting every aspect of our lives.
with some, oh dear, these...
From sporting glory.
It's all over. It is now. It's 4.
To the birth of local radio.
We've had the Postmaster General to open the station, the Lord Mayor of Leicester's.
After hours of shooting and facing a line of troops, the crowd is still here.
And the unfolding of world history.
I'm going to give you a damn good thrashing.
The corporation has created countless smaller cultural institutions, from shows across genres such as comedy, and programmes in drama,
there is more
to national treasures,
meaning and mutual understanding and exchanging a glance.
Along the way, the BBC has made a habit of annoying prime ministers.
Thank you for what the BBC, if they're true to their usual form, will tonight describe as a hostile reception.
And been responsible for some appalling scandals. Throughout its century, technological innovation has powered the BBC. From the birth of collective eavesdropping, known as radio, to Alexandra Palace here in North London, where the first public television transmissions were made, new technologies allowed the BBC to reach ever bigger audiences and secure its emotional contract with the people. But today's new technologies, the internet, smartphones, social media, have weakened the BBC's grip on our culture and, together with political pressure, threaten its future. In an age of superabundant choice, there is a generational divide in consumption of BBC shows. Older people remain deeply attached and, mostly, willing to pay. Young people, less so.
Now we bid you good night, and the next tonight will be tomorrow night. Good night.
Britain has changed almost beyond recognition over a century, and so has the BBC.
This is the BBC television service.
To remain relevant, vital and loved, it needs to use the latest technology to secure a new contract with the people and persuade them that it is worth paying for.
The nations and the regions for the news where you are. Goodbye.
Amal Rajan, BBC News.
That was just to confuse you. I'm still here. So is Chris Fawkes, and he's got the weather for you.
Hi, Sophie. Well, you know, weather forecasts on TV aren't quite that old. The first one went out in 1954. Today, though, I thought we'd take a look at contrasting weather we've had across the UK. What looks like quite a grey and cool kind of landscape in the southwest of England. It was actually one of the warmest places, 19 degrees this afternoon. Most of us saw some sunshine, but across Scotland, the sunshine wasn't necessarily accompanied by high temperatures. Indeed, if we look at the air mass here, you can see some cooler air associated with that area of high pressure, which is due to slip its way eastwards over the next few days, trapping low pressure right over the top of the British Isles. And that means we are going to see more unsettled weather conditions coming our way. First signs of change starting to make inroads in from the southwest overnight tonight, with some rain arriving. The north and east stays dry. But look at these temperatures by the end of the night, 16 degrees in Plymouth. It is going to be a very mild night indeed. Tomorrow, expect more cloud around. There'll still be a few bright or sunny spells, but we've got these bursts of rain erratically arriving from the south and west. A much windier kind of day, but despite more cloud, more wind, still very mild England and Wales, 18 or 19 degrees for the highest temperatures, whereas in Scotland, those temperatures 10 to 12, just a little bit below average for the time of year. This area of low pressure then going nowhere fast. It's trapped by high pressure in Europe. And so Thursday is an unsettled day. We've got outbreaks of rain moving the way northwards and eastwards across the country. Sunshine follows, but there could be a few showers later in the day. Still very mild for most of us. Temperatures coming up in Northern Ireland, 16 degrees as we head through Thursday. And if you're looking for signs of change in the weather forecast for Friday, through the weekend and into next week, that same area of low pressure is still with us, and that means it stays unsettled with further rain and showers on the way. Sophie.
Chris, thank you. And that is it from the BBC News at 6. The news continues here on BBC One as it's time to join our teams across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Goodbye.